There's nothing quite like the bond between a farmer and his dog. For 30 years, Dr. Harold Matthews watched that special relationship play out across Cedar Valley's farms. When Tom Henderson's loyal sheepdog Rusty collapsed in the barn, his legs swollen and painful, it seemed like another routine call. Harold had treated thousands of animals over the years, but when he looked closer at what was inside that swollen leg, everything changed. What he found was a parasite that could destroy every farm in the valley. Soon, panic spread through the community as families realized their entire way of life was at risk. Harold, now 58 and tired from decades of long nights, faced his biggest challenge yet. He had to find a way to save not just the animals, but the farming families who depended on them. But would one aging veterinarian be enough to stop this disaster? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Valley as Dr. Harold Matthews loaded his weathered veterinary bag into the cab of his pickup truck. The leather bag had been his mentor's once, Dr. William Preston, who'd served these same farming families for 40 years before passing the torch to Harold 3 decades ago. The brass nameplate had worn smooth over the years, but Harold could still make out the etched letters when he held it to the light, just right. Harold paused at his truck door, breathing in the crisp September air. At 58, he felt every one of his years in the ache of his lower back and the stiffness in his knees when he climbed down from examining tables. His dark hair had gone completely grey at the temples, and deep lines mapped the corners of his eyes from squinting in barnlight and bright pasture. Sun-dot Cedar Valley stretched before him in rolling green hills, dotted with red barns and white farmhouses. The community had been built by German immigrants in the 1880s, and many of the families still farmed the same land their great-grandfathers had cleared by hand. But the valley wasn't what it used to be. Harold counted at least 12 farms that had been sold to developers in the past 5 years, their fields now sprouting suburban houses instead of corn and soybeans. The remaining farms struggled with aging equipment, unpredictable weather, and commodity prices that seemed to favor everyone except the people who actually grew the food. Most of the farmers were Harold's age or older, their children having moved to the cities for steadier work and health insurance. The Henderson farm where he was headed this morning was one of the exceptions. Tom Henderson's son Jake had returned from college last year, determined to modernize the operation and keep the family legacy alive. Harold, S cell phone buzzed against his hip. Sarah, his office manager and the closest thing he had to family since his wife Mary passed 5 years ago, was checking his schedule. "Morning, Doc," came Sarah's familiar voice. "Just confirming you're headed to the Henderson place." At first, Tom sounded pretty worried about that dog of his. "On my way now," Harold replied, settling into the driver's seat. The truck's interior smelled of antiseptic hay and the faint leather scent of his medical bag. "What did he tell you exactly?" "Said Rusty was limping yesterday evening, but this morning the leg was swollen up something fierce. Dog won't put any weight on it at all." Harold frowned as he turned onto Meadowbrook Road. Rusty was a border collie, maybe 7 years old, and one of the finest working dogs in the valley. The dog could move 100 head of sheep with nothing but a whistle and a gesture from Tom. If Rusty was down, the timing couldn't be worse. The Hendersons were in the middle of moving their flock to winter pasture. The Henderson farm sat on 200 acres of prime grazing land with a white 2-story farmhouse that Tom's grandfather had built in 1923. The red barn bore fresh paint. Jake's influence, Harold suspected. The young man had big plans for sustainable farming practices and direct-to-consumer sales. Harold admired the ambition, even if he worried about the debt load Jake was taking on. Tom Henderson met Harold at the barn, his weathered face creased with concern. At 62, Tom moved with the measured gait of a man who'd spent his life doing physical work. His flannel shirt was rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms still powerful despite his age. "Thanks for coming so quick, Doc," Tom said, leading Harold toward the barn. "I've never seen anything quite like this. Rusty's been my right hand for 7 years, never had a sick day." Inside the barn, the familiar smells of hay and animals created an atmosphere Harold had known for 3 decades. Rusty lay in a corner, stall on a bed of fresh straw, his usual alert expression replaced by a dull pain. The dog's right front leg was visibly swollen from the shoulder down to the paw, the skin tight and discolored. Harold knelt beside the dog, speaking in the gentle tones he'd perfected over thousands of similar encounters. "Easy, boy. Let's see. What's troubling you?" Rusty whimpered softly as Harold's experienced hands began their examination. The swelling felt different than Harold expected. Not the firm heat of infection or the yielding softness of fluid buildup. There was something almost granular about the texture under the skin, as if tiny objects were scattered throughout the tissue. "When did you first notice the limping?" Harold asked, pulling his stethoscope from the bag. "Yesterday around 5, when we were bringing the sheep in," Tom replied. "Thought maybe he'd stepped wrong on a rock. But this morning," Tom gestured helplessly at the swollen limb, "I've never seen anything happen so fast." Harold listened to Rusty's heart and lungs, both of which sounded normal. The dog's temperature was slightly elevated, but not dramatically. So, what concerned Harold most was Rusty's behavior. The dog lay unusually still, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Tom, I'm going to need to take Rusty back to the clinic," Harold said, standing and brushing straw from his knees. "This needs a closer look than I can give him here." Tom's face tightened. Harold knew money was always a concern for the farming families. Veterinary bills competed with equipment repairs, seed costs, and loan payments in an endless juggling. "Do what you need to do, Doc," Tom said quietly. "Rusty's family." The drive back to Harold's clinic took 20 minutes, with Rusty resting quietly in a transport crate in the truck bed. Harold's clinic occupied a converted house on the edge of town, its examination rooms and surgical suite carved from what had once been a family home. Sarah greeted them at the back door, her grey hair pulled into its usual practical bun. "How's our patient?" she asked, helping Harold carry the crate inside. "Not sure yet," Harold admitted. "Something I haven't seen before." In the examination room, Harold began a more thorough evaluation. Under the bright surgical lights, the swelling in Rusty's leg looked even more unusual. The skin showed a mottled pattern of discoloration, and Harold could feel distinct lumps beneath the surface. He prepared a syringe for a tissue sample, knowing he needed to understand what was causing the dramatic swelling. As the needle penetrated the affected area, Harold felt it encounter something solid, not bone, not cartilage, but something that seemed to shift and move under pressure. The sample he drew contained fluid, but suspended within it were tiny white objects that moved with their own seeming purpose. Harold stared at the syringe contents, his 30 years of experience offering no explanation for what he was seeing. "Sarah," he called, his voice carrying a note she'd learned to recognize over their 15 years working together. "I need the microscope, and call Dr. Rodriguez at the State Veterinary Lab. Tell her I have something she needs to see." As Harold prepared the microscope slide, his hands moved with practiced precision despite the growing unease in his chest. Whatever was in Rusty's leg was unlike anything in his considerable experience. The white objects in the sample seemed almost purposeful in their movement, and Harold found himself wondering if he was looking at something that could threaten more than just one loyal sheepdog. The microscope revealed what Harold had begun to suspect: parasites, but of a type he'd never encountered. They were elongated, segmented creatures about the size of rice grains, with what appeared to be primitive sensory organs at one end. Most disturbing was their apparent coordination. They seemed to move in response to each other, as if communicating. Harold sat back from the microscope, his mind racing through possibilities. In 30 years of veterinary practice, he'd seen parasites that could kill livestock, diseases that could bankrupt farmers, and conditions that defied easy treatment. But this felt different. This felt like something that could change everything. For the farms and families he'd spent his life serving. The phone rang, and Sarah's voice came through the intercom. "Dr. Rodriguez is driving up from the capital. She'll be here in 2 hours." Harold looked down at Rusty, who gazed back with trusting eyes despite his obvious pain. The dog had no way of knowing that what was happening to him might be the beginning of something that could threaten every farm in Cedar Valley. But Harold was beginning to suspect that this morning's routine call was anything but routine. As he prepared medications to make Rusty more comfortable, Harold's mind turned to the other farms in the valley. How many more animals might already be affected? How fast could this unknown parasite spread? And most importantly, how could he protect the community that had become his life's work? Outside his clinic windows, Cedar Valley continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware that everything might be about to change. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived at Harold's clinic with the urgency of someone who understood that veterinary emergencies didn't follow office hours. At 45, she carried herself with the confident bearing of a woman who'd spent 15 years investigating animal diseases for the state. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as she surveyed Harold's modest facility. "Show me what you've got, Harold," she said without preamble, setting down a metal case that Harold recognized as portable laboratory equipment. Harold led her to the examination room where Rusty lay sedated but stable. The swelling in the dog's leg had increased noticeably in the 2 hours since Rodriguez's call, and the discoloration had spread upward toward the shoulder. "I've never seen anything like it," Harold admitted, handing her the microscope slide he'd prepared. "The parasites, if that's what they are, seem to move with purpose, almost like they're organized." Rodriguez bent over the microscope, adjusting the focus with practiced precision. Harold watched her expression change from professional interest to concern, then to something approaching alarm. "These aren't in any veterinary parasitology text I've studied," she said, straightening up. "The segmentation pattern is wrong for any known species. And you're right about the coordination. That's not normal parasite behavior." She moved to her portable equipment, preparing additional slides and staining solutions. "I need to run some tests. But Harold, I'm going to ask you something important. Have you seen any other animals with similar symptoms? Any other farms reporting unusual illnesses?" Harold shook his head. "Not yet. But I haven't been looking for this specifically. Tom Henderson's farm is fairly isolated. If this is spreading, we might not know for days." Rodriguez worked in focused silence for 20 minutes, running tests that Harold's clinic wasn't equipped to perform. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "These organisms show characteristics of both parasites and bacterial colonies," she said. "That shouldn't be possible. The cell structure suggests they're parasitic, but they're exhibiting collective behavior that's more typical of certain bacterial infections. And Harold," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the reproductive rate appears to be exponential." Meaning, if I'm reading these cell division markers correctly, the population in this dog's leg has probably doubled since this morning, maybe more than doubled. Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the clinic's air conditioning. "What's the transmission vector?" "Unknown. Could be contact, could be environmental, could be through insects or other carriers. Until we understand more about these organisms, we have to assume worst-case scenarios for everything." Rodriguez began packing her equipment with quick, efficient movements. "I'm taking these samples back to the state lab for full analysis. We should have preliminary results by tomorrow morning. But Harold, I need you to do something for me. Name it. Start calling every farm in your coverage area. Ask specifically about dogs and working animals showing any signs of leg swelling, lethargy, or unusual behavior. Don't mention parasites. Just say you're following up on a possible infection. I don't want to start a panic until we know what we're dealing with." Harold nodded, understanding the delicate balance between caution and alarm. What about treatment protocols? That's the problem. I don't know yet. Standard anti-parasitic. Drugs might work, or they might make things worse if we're dealing with a hybrid organism. We need to identify exactly what this is before we start throwing treatments at it. After Rodriguez left, Harold sat alone with Rusty, who remained sedated but seemed to be breathing more easily. The dog's leg, however, continued to worsen. The swelling had progressed noticeably even in the hour since Rodriguez's examination. Harold picked up his phone and began the calls Rodriguez had requested. The first few farms reported nothing unusual, but as he worked through his contact list, a pattern began to emerge that made his stomach tighten with dread. The Kowalski farm. Their border collie had been limping for 2 days. Margaret Schneider's German Shepherd was off his food and favoring his back leg. The Patterson place had a cattle dog that wouldn't come out of the barn this morning. Each call revealed another piece of a puzzle Harold didn't want to complete. The affected animals were all working dogs, all showing similar symptoms and all on farms within a roughly 20-mile radius of the Henderson place. By evening, Harold had confirmed 12 cases. 12 families whose beloved working partners were suddenly ill with something nobody understood. Some of the symptoms had appeared as recently as this morning, while others had been developing for 3 or 4 days. Harold called Tom Henderson to check on the farm and break the news that Rusty's condition might not be isolated. "Doc, I've got some bad news of my own," Tom said before Harold could speak. "Jake found 3 of our sheep this afternoon showing signs of leg swelling. Different from what happened to Rusty, but, well, it doesn't look good." Harold closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years of veterinary practice settle on his shoulders. "Tom, I need you to isolate those sheep immediately. Don't let them mix with the rest of the flock. And call your neighbors. Tell them to watch their animals closely for any signs of swelling or lameness. You think this thing is spreading. I think we need to prepare for that possibility." After ending the call, Harold sat in his clinic office, surrounded by case files and veterinary journals, searching for any precedent for what he was seeing. The silence was broken only by the hum of the building's ventilation system and Rusty's occasional soft whimper from the recovery area. His phone rang again. Sarah's number. "Doc, I'm sorry to call so late, but I've got the Patterson family online too. They say their cattle dog collapsed an hour ago, and they're asking if they should bring him in tonight." Harold looked at the clock. Nearly 9 p.m. In 30 years of practice, he'd taken thousands of emergency calls, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something that would test everything he'd learned about caring for animals and supporting the families who depended on them. "Tell them to bring him in," Harold said, "and Sarah, call the emergency contact list. We're going to need help." As Harold prepared for another patient, he thought about the microscope slide sitting in his laboratory. Those tiny, segmented organisms moving with purpose and coordination. Rodriguez had called them a hybrid, something that shouldn't exist. According to everything they knew about parasitic biology, Harold had built his career on knowledge, experience, and the steady accumulation of wisdom about animal health and disease. But tonight, as he prepared to examine another affected animal, he realized he was facing something entirely outside his experience, something that could threaten not just individual animals, but the entire way of life that defined Cedar Valley. The clinic's back door chimed as the Patterson family arrived with their unconscious cattle dog. Harold took a deep breath, picked up his stethoscope, and walked toward another encounter with the unknown. Whatever was happening to the animals of Cedar Valley, he was now at the center of it. And deep down, Harold suspected this was only the beginning. Harold's emergency phone list had been handwritten on a piece of cardboard 15 years ago, updated with crossed-out numbers and new additions in different colored ink. The list represented decades of professional relationships, veterinarians. Within a 100-mile radius, agricultural extension agents, state officials, and emergency contacts for livestock emergencies. Tonight, That worn piece of cardboard might be the key to preventing a disaster. By 6 a.m., Harold had been awake for 22 hours straight. The Patterson family's cattle dog had shown the same mysterious swelling as Rusty, but the progression was faster, much faster. What had taken days to develop in other animals was happening in hours. Harold had stabilized the dog with IV fluids and pain medication, but he felt like he was treating symptoms while the real enemy remained invisible. Sarah arrived at the clinic with coffee and the grim determination she'd shown during every crisis. In their 15 years together, how many calls came in overnight? She asked, surveying the examination rooms that now held 4 affected dogs. 7 more farms, Harold replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. And Sarah, it's not just dogs anymore. The Henderson sheep, 2 horses at the Miller place, and a dairy cow at Riverside Farm. Whatever this is, it's not species-specific. Sarah's face paled. She'd grown up on a dairy farm herself and understood the implications better than most. Have you reached Dr. Rodriguez? She's supposed to call with preliminary lab results this morning. But I've been thinking, we can't wait for official protocols. I need to contact the state veterinary office directly. Harold had dealt with state bureaucrats before, well-meaning people who understood regulations better than they understood the reality of rural veterinary practice. They would want forms filled out, procedures followed, and official channels observed. Meanwhile, animals were suffering, and the infection, or whatever this was, continued to spread. The phone rang, and Harold grabbed it before the first ring finished. Dr. Matthews? This is Dr. James Cartwright from the State Animal Health Division. Dr. Rodriguez briefed me on your situation. We need to talk. Harold felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Official attention meant resources, but it also meant oversight and potential restrictions that could complicate his ability to help affected animals. I'm listening, Dr. Cartwright. First, we're establishing a quarantine protocol for all affected properties. No animal movement in or out until we understand the transmission mechanism. Second, we're sending a mobile lab unit to your location. They should arrive by noon. Third, I need you to compile a complete list of all affected animals and properties. Harold looked out his window at Cedar Valley, where farmers would be starting their morning routines, unaware that their world was about to change dramatically. Dr. Cartwright, these are working farms. Quarantine means no livestock sales, no movement of breeding animals, no access to processing facilities. Some of these families are already operating on thin margins. I understand the economic implications, Dr. Matthews, but containment is our first priority. We're dealing with an unknown pathogen that appears to be highly contagious and potentially devastating to livestock populations. After ending the call, Harold sat quietly for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what was happening. Quarantine would effectively shut down normal farm operations across a 20-mile radius. Families who depended on livestock sales for their livelihood would face immediate financial hardship. Sarah knocked on his office door. Doc, Tom Henderson is here, says he needs to talk to you about something important. Tom entered Harold's office, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His usual steady demeanor was replaced by barely controlled anxiety. Harold, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me, Tom said, settling into the chair across from Harold's desk. Is my farm going to survive this? The question hung in the air between them. Harold had known Tom for 25 years, had delivered calves during midnight blizzards, had put down Tom's favorite horse when cancer made the animal's life unbearable. They'd shared the kind of bond that develops between men who work with their hands and care for living things. I don't know, Harold admitted, but I know we're going to do everything possible to find answers and protect your animals. Tom nodded, slowly. The state people called this morning. Quarantine starts immediately. No livestock sales, no movement of animals to other properties. Jake calculated our cash flow last night. Without livestock sales, we've got maybe 2 months before we start missing loan payments. Harold felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The Henderson farm represented 4 generations of careful stewardship. Jake's plans for modernization and sustainable practices could revolutionize farming in Cedar Valley, but only if the farm survived the current crisis. "What do you need from me, Tom?" "Information. Jake's been researching this morning, calling veterinary schools, checking with extension agents in other states. He thinks maybe this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Maybe there are treatments we don't know about yet." Harold pulled out a notepad and began writing. "I'll call every veterinary college in the region. If there have been similar cases elsewhere, we'll find them. And Tom, we're not facing this alone. The state lab is sending a mobile unit and Dr. Rodriguez is running every test she can think of." Tom stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Harold, there's something else. The dogs that got sick first, Rusty and the Patterson dog, they both spent time in the south pasture near Miller Creek. Jake thinks maybe that's where this thing started." After Tom left, Harold stared at his notepad, adding Miller Creek investigation to his growing list of urgent tasks. If there was an environmental source for the mysterious organism, identifying and containing it could be crucial to stopping the spread. The morning brought a steady stream of calls from worried farmers. Each conversation followed the same pattern: animals showing symptoms, families facing financial uncertainty, and people looking to Harold for answers he didn't have. By 10 a.m., the confirmed case count had reached 18 farms with over 40 affected animals. Dr. Rodriguez called with preliminary lab results that raised more questions than they answered. "The organisms are unlike anything in our database," she reported. "They show characteristics of multiple pathogen types, and they're adapting to different host species in real time. Harold, I've never seen anything evolve this quickly." "What? About treatment options?" "That's the problem. Standard treatments seem to accelerate the organism's reproduction rate. It's as if they're using the medications as a growth medium. We're going to have to develop entirely new protocols." Harold absorbed this information, understanding that every treatment assumption he'd developed over 30 years of practice might be wrong. The organisms weren't just unknown, they were actively resistant to conventional veterinary medicine. Sarah appeared in his doorway, holding the emergency phone list. "Doc, you've got calls backed up from 12 more farms and the state. Mobile unit just called. They're running 2 hours behind schedule. What do you want me to tell people?" Harold looked at the list in Sarah's hands, at the examination rooms filled with suffering animals, and at the window overlooking a valley where families waited for answers he couldn't provide. For 30 years, his veterinary bag and his accumulated knowledge had been enough to handle whatever challenges rural practice presented. But today, for the first time in his career, Harold was beginning to understand that knowledge and experience might not be enough to protect the community that had become his life's work. Tom Henderson's farm ledger lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with neat columns of numbers that told the story of 4 generations of careful farming. Jake Henderson sat across from his father, calculator in hand, while the morning light streamed through windows that had looked out over the same fields since 1923. The numbers on the page represented more than just finances. They represented the survival of a way of life. "Dad, I've run the calculations 3 different ways," Jake said, his voice tight with stress. "Without livestock sales, we've got 8 weeks of operating capital, maybe 10 if we defer the equipment loan payment." Tom studied his son's face, seeing Mary's determination mixed with his own stubborn streak. At 26, Jake had the kind of optimism that comes from believing problems have solutions if you just work hard enough to find them. Tom remembered having that same confidence at Jake's age. "What about the emergency fund?" Tom asked. "That's what gets us to 10 weeks instead of 8. Jake closed the ledger and rubbed his eyes. "Dad, Dr. Matthews called this morning. They're bringing in specialists from the state university. Maybe they'll have answers." Harold arrived at the Henderson farm as Jake was walking the fence line of the south pasture, looking for anything unusual near Miller Creek. The young man moved with purpose, stopping frequently to examine the ground and take notes on a yellow pad. "Find anything interesting?" Harold called, climbing out of his truck. Jake jogged over, holding up a soil sample in a glass jar. "Maybe. The ground near the creek shows some discoloration I've never noticed before. And Dad said the sheep that got sick first were the ones that spent the most time drinking from this section of the creek." Harold accepted the jar, noting the slightly oily appearance of the soil and a faint odor he couldn't quite identify. "We'll get this tested. The state lab should be able to tell us if there's anything unusual." They walked toward the house, where Tom waited on the porch with coffee and the kind of serious expression Harold had learned to recognize over 25 years of friendship. "Harold, we need to talk about money," Tom said without preamble. "The quarantine means no income, but the bills don't stop. Feed costs, medication for the sick animals, loan payments, it all keeps coming." Harold had been dreading this conversation. In 30 years of rural practice, he'd watched economic pressures destroy more farms than disease or weather combined. Good families, hard-working people, driven out of business by forces beyond their control. "Tom, I'm not going to send you bills while we're dealing with this crisis," Harold said. "Whatever treatment costs we're running up, we'll figure that out later." "That's not fair to you," Tom replied. "You've got your own overhead, your own expenses." Jake looked between his father and Harold, understanding the weight of the conversation. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" he said. "Instead of just trying to survive the quarantine, maybe we should be thinking about how to help solve the problem." Harold raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I've been reading everything I can find about similar outbreaks in other parts of the country. There was something in Montana 2 years ago and a case in North Dakota that might be related. But here's the thing: in both cases, local farmers who worked directly with researchers had better outcomes than farms that just waited for official solutions." Tom leaned forward. "You're thinking we should turn this place into some kind of research site? Why not? We've got the affected animals, we've got the suspected environmental source, and we've got detailed records going back 4 generations. If researchers need a base of operations, why shouldn't it be here?" Harold considered the proposal. It made sense from a scientific standpoint, but it would mean more disruption to the Henderson family's already strained situation. "The state mobile lab unit is supposed to arrive this afternoon," Harold said. "Let me talk to them about using your farm as a primary research site. It might actually provide some income to offset the quarantine losses." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Schneider, whose German Shepherd was one of the affected animals. Margaret had been widowed 3 years earlier and was struggling to maintain her small dairy operation with limited help. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, approaching the porch with obvious reluctance. "But I wanted to ask Dr. Matthews, what happens if I can't afford the treatment costs? Rex is all the help I've got with the dairy cows, and without him..." Harold saw the fear in her eyes and understood the impossible position many of the affected families were facing. Treatment costs for an unknown condition could easily run into thousands of dollars per animal, money that most small farms simply didn't have. "Margaret, nobody's going to lose their animals because of treatment costs," Harold said. "We'll find a way to work this out." After Margaret left, Tom turned to Harold with a serious expression. "How many other families are facing the same choice? Pay for treatment they can't afford or watch their animals suffer?" "Too many," Harold admitted. "The Kowalski farm, the Patterson place, probably half the affected properties. Most of these families are operating on margins that don't allow for unexpected veterinary emergencies." Jake pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts. "What if we organize some kind of community response? Pool resources, share costs, coordinate care." Harold watched Jake's fingers move across the phone screen, remembering his own youthful certainty that problems could be solved through determination and hard work. The difference was that Jake might actually be right. "You're thinking like a cooperative," Harold said. "Exactly. Grandpa's generation did it during the Depression, shared equipment, helped with harvests, supported each other through tough times. Why can't we do the same thing now? Tom nodded slowly. Your great-grandfather used to talk about how neighbors would come together when one family faced disaster. Barn raisings, harvest crews, lending money without interest when someone was short. Harold felt a spark of hope for the first time since discovering the mysterious organisms in Rusty's leg. Individual families facing the crisis alone might not survive, but a coordinated community response could change the odds dramatically. If we're going to do this, Harold said, we need to move fast. The state lab unit arrives in 4 hours, and that's when we'll start getting real answers about what we're dealing with. If we can present them with an organized community response instead of scattered individual cases, we might get better cooperation and more resources. Jake was already dialing the first number on his contact list. Give me 2 hours, he said. I'll have every affected farm signed up for a coordinated response plan. As Harold drove back toward town, he reflected on the conversation he'd just witnessed. 3 generations of Henderson men facing a crisis that threatened everything they'd built, choosing to fight back by working together with their neighbors. It reminded him why he'd chosen to spend his life serving this community. The state mobile laboratory unit arrived at Harold's clinic like a small invasion. 3 white vehicles with official seals, carrying equipment worth more than Harold's entire practice, staffed by specialists who treated the mysterious organism. Outbreak as an academic problem rather than a threat to people's livelihoods. Dr. Susan Kellner, the lead researcher, wore the kind of pristine white coat that suggested most of her work happened in controlled laboratory environments. Harold, S. Worn veterinary journal sat open on his desk, its pages filled with handwritten observations from 30 years of practice. The journal contained notes on seasonal disease patterns, treatment successes and failures, and the kind of practical knowledge that came from working with animals in real-world conditions. But as he watched the state team unpack sophisticated diagnostic equipment, Harold wondered if his accumulated wisdom would matter in solving this crisis. And Dr. Matthews, Dr. Kellner said, reviewing the case files Harold had prepared. We're going to need to restructure your treatment protocols completely. Standard veterinary approaches appear counterproductive with this organism. Harold bit back, his first response reminding himself that cooperation would serve the affected animals better than territorial disputes. What do you recommend? Complete isolation of all affected animals, suspension of all medication except supportive care, and implementation of strict biosafety protocols. We need to treat this like a potential zoonotic disease until we prove otherwise. The implications hit Harold immediately. Zoonotic meant the disease could transfer from animals to humans. If that was the case, every farmer who'd been caring for sick animals was potentially at risk, and the crisis would expand beyond veterinary medicine into human health. Have there been any human cases? Harold asked. Not yet, but the organism shows characteristics that suggest cross-species adaptation capability. Dr. Rodriguez found evidence that it's already jumped between multiple animal species in just a few days. Harold thought about Tom Henderson and Jake working closely with affected sheep, Margaret Schneider caring for her sick German shepherd, and dozens of other farmers who'd been in direct contact with infected animals. If the organism could adapt to humans, we need to notify everyone immediately, Harold said. Dr. Kellner nodded. We're coordinating with the county health department. But Dr. Matthews, this changes the entire scope of our response. We're no longer dealing with a veterinary emergency. We're potentially looking at a public health crisis. The afternoon brought a steady parade of officials to Harold's clinic. County health inspectors, state agriculture representatives, and federal observers from the Centers for Disease Control. Each agency brought its own protocols, requirements, and bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed to slow rather than accelerate the response to the crisis. Harold found himself caught between the official response and the needs of his community. The state team wanted to relocate all affected animals to a central facility for study and treatment. The farmers wanted their animals treated on site, where they could monitor progress and maintain some control over their operations. "Dr. Matthews," Tom Henderson called Harold's cell phone directly, bypassing Sarah's screening. "They want to take our sheep. All of them, sick and healthy, say it's for containment and research." Harold closed his eyes, understanding the impossible position Tom was facing. The sheep represented years of careful breeding, genetic lines developed specifically for Cedar Valley's climate and grazing conditions. More importantly, they represented the Henderson family's primary source of income and Jake's plans for the future. "What did you tell them?" "That I needed to talk to you first. But Harold, they're not asking, they're telling. They've got legal authority under agricultural emergency powers." Harold looked around his clinic, now transformed into a command center for the official response. Specialists in protective equipment moved through rooms where he'd spent 30 years providing personal, hands-on care to animals and their families. The contrast felt like a fundamental shift in how veterinary medicine was practiced. "Tom, let me talk to Dr. Kellner. Maybe we can work out a compromise." But when Harold approached Dr. Kellner about keeping affected animals on their home farms, her response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Dr. Matthews, you need to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. This organism shows adaptation capabilities we've never documented before. It's jumped from dogs to sheep to cattle to horses in less than a week. Centralized containment is the only way to prevent wider spread. These animals have names," Harold said quietly. "They're not just research subjects, they're family members, working partners, and the economic foundation of this community." "Doctor," Kellner's expression softened slightly. "I understand the emotional attachment, Dr. Matthews, but our priority has to be preventing a wider outbreak that could devastate livestock populations across multiple states." Harold walked outside to clear his head, looking across Cedar Valley toward the Henderson farm, where 4 generations of careful stewardship were about to be dismantled in the name of scientific protocol. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Henderson, community meeting tonight, 7 p.m., Henderson Farm. Need you there." The meeting that evening drew more people than Harold had seen gathered in Cedar Valley since the annual Harvest Festival. Farmers, their families, and townspeople who depended on agriculture for their livelihoods filled the Henderson barn. The atmosphere was tense, with quiet conversations and worried expressions replacing the usual social warmth of community gatherings. Jake stood before the group, his young face showing the strain of the past few days. "Most of you know what we're facing. Our animals are sick with something nobody understands, and the state wants to take them away for research. Meanwhile, we're looking at financial ruin if the quarantine continues much longer." Margaret Schneider raised her hand. "What are our options? Can we refuse to turn over the animals?" "Legally, no," Tom Henderson replied. "Agricultural emergency powers give them authority to seize livestock for containment purposes." An older farmer named Carl Muller stood up. "My grandfather lost his farm during the Depression because he couldn't adapt fast enough to changing conditions. I'm not going to let some laboratory people make decisions about my cattle without having a say in the matter." Harold listened to the discussion, hearing frustration, fear, and the kind of quiet determination that had built the farming community of Cedar Valley. These were people who'd faced droughts, floods, market crashes, and changing agricultural policies. They'd survived by adapting, cooperating, and supporting each other through difficult times. "What if we offered an alternative?" Jake said. "What if instead of giving up control completely, we proposed a partnership? Our farms become research sites, but we maintain ownership and decision-making authority." Dr. Kellner had mentioned the need for controlled study environments and detailed monitoring capabilities. The Henderson farm already had infrastructure, historical records, and a cooperative family willing to support research activities. Other affected farms could provide additional study sites while maintaining family control. Harold stood up, feeling the weight of 30 years of community trust. I think Jake's onto something. The state team needs research sites and cooperation from farm families. We need to keep our animals and maintain some control over our operations. Maybe there's a way to serve both needs. The discussion continued for 2 hours, with families sharing concerns, resources, and ideas for cooperative response to the crisis. By the end of the meeting, Cedar Valley's farming community had committed to presenting a unified proposal to the state team: partnership rather than surrender, cooperation rather than compliance. The CDC field laboratory report arrived at Harold's clinic at dawn, delivered by a courier who waited while Dr. Kellner reviewed the contents. Harold watched her face change as she read, her professional composure giving way to something approaching. Genuine alarm? The manila folder in her hands contained laboratory results that would reshape everything they thought they understood about the mysterious organism. "Dr. Matthews," she said, looking up from the report, "we need to talk, privately." Harold led her to his office, where the morning light revealed dust motes dancing above stacks of case files that represented 30 years of veterinary practice. The familiar surroundings felt somehow fragile now, as if the solid foundation of his professional life was about to shift beneath his feet. "The organism isn't just adapting to different host species," Dr. Kellner said, her voice carefully controlled. "It's incorporating genetic material from each host and using that information to optimize its own survival strategies. In simple terms, it's learning from every animal it infects." Harold absorbed this information slowly, learning how, every time it encounters a new immune response, it adapts. Every time we try a different treatment, it develops resistance. The samples from animals infected 4 days ago show completely different characteristics from samples taken yesterday. It's evolving in real time. The implications were staggering. Traditional veterinary medicine relied on understanding pathogen behavior patterns developed over time. But if the organism changed its fundamental characteristics every few days, conventional treatment approaches would be useless. What does this mean for the affected animals? It means we're fighting an enemy that gets smarter every time we engage with it. And Dr. Matthews? Dr. Kellner paused, choosing her words carefully. The latest samples show genetic sequences that don't exist in nature. This organism has characteristics that suggest artificial origin. Harold felt the floor seem to shift under his feet. Artificial origin? We're not sure yet, but some of the genetic markers are consistent with laboratory modification. It's possible we're dealing with something that was engineered, either intentionally or accidentally. The morning brought a new urgency to the response effort. If the organism was artificially created, the source had to be identified to prevent further spread. Harold found himself thinking about Jake's soil samples from Miller Creek and the environmental testing that had been postponed while they focused on treating affected animals. Dr. Rodriguez arrived from the state lab with a team of environmental specialists, their equipment loaded into vehicles that looked more like a military convoy than a scientific expedition. Her usual professional demeanor was replaced by the grim focus of someone who understood they might be dealing with bioterrorism or industrial accident on a massive scale. "Harold," she said, pulling him aside as her team unloaded detection equipment, "we're treating Miller Creek as a potential contamination site. The soil samples Jake collected show trace elements that don't occur naturally in this region." "What kind of trace elements?" "Rare earth metals, synthetic organic compounds, and isotopes that are only produced in specialized laboratory settings. Something was dumped or accidentally released upstream from the Henderson farm." Harold thought about the dozens of families whose animals had been drinking from Miller Creek and its tributaries. The organism might have originated from an external source, but it had found perfect conditions for spread and evolution in Cedar Valley's interconnected network of farms and livestock. The environmental team worked with systematic precision, taking samples every 100 yards along Miller Creek's entire length within the quarantine zone. Harold watched them work, understanding that they were trying to trace the organism back to its source while simultaneously documenting its spread pattern. Tom Henderson approached Harold as the environmental team set up testing equipment on his property. "They found something upstream," Tom said quietly, "about 2 miles above our property line, near the old Brennan place." Harold knew the Brennan property, a small farm that had been abandoned 5 years earlier when the family moved to Arizona for health reasons. The property had sat empty since then, gradually reverting to natural vegetation as the buildings deteriorated from neglect. What did they find? Some kind of buried containers, industrial waste drums, maybe 20 or 30 of them. The environmental team is treating it like a hazmat site. Harold felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. Illegal dumping of laboratory waste would explain the artificial genetic markers Dr. Kellner had found in the organism samples. It would also explain why the contamination was concentrated around Miller Creek and why the organism showed such unusual adaptation capabilities. Dr. Kellner's phone rang, and Harold watched her expression change as she listened to whoever was calling. When she ended the call, she looked directly at Harold, with the expression of someone about to deliver very bad news. "That was the CDC. They've confirmed the presence of engineered genetic sequences in our organism samples. This is officially a federal investigation now, which means new protocols, new authority structures, and unfortunately, new restrictions on local decision-making." Harold understood immediately. Federal involvement meant the community's carefully negotiated partnership proposal would be irrelevant. Decisions would be made by agencies with national security concerns rather than agricultural specialists focused on livestock health. What does that mean for the affected animals? Complete federal quarantine, immediate removal of all potentially infected livestock to secure facilities, and indefinite restrictions on property access. "Dr. Matthews, I know this isn't what the community wanted, but we're no longer dealing with a veterinary emergency. We're dealing with potential bioterrorism." Harold thought about the meeting in the Henderson barn, where families had committed to working together to protect their animals and their way of life. All of those plans were about to become irrelevant in the face of federal authority and national security protocols. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake Henderson. "Federal agents arriving. They want to evacuate all livestock immediately. Dad says we need to talk before they get here." Harold looked around his clinic, where state specialists continued their work with the quiet efficiency of people following established protocols. But outside, he could see federal vehicles arriving, black SUVs and official sedans that suggested the crisis had moved beyond veterinary medicine into realms he'd never encountered in 30 years of rural practice. The organism in Rusty's leg had started as a mysterious veterinary case. Now it threatened to destroy not just individual animals, but the entire social and economic structure of Cedar Valley's farming community. And if Dr. Kellner was right about artificial origin, the implications extended far beyond their small valley into questions of bioterrorism and national security. Harold grabbed his veterinary bag and headed for the door. Whatever was about to happen, he needed to be with the families who had trusted him for 3 decades to protect their animals and support their way of life. The federal agents might have authority, but Harold had something more valuable: the trust of people who understood that survival meant standing together when everything familiar was under threat. Harold arrived at the Henderson farm to find Jake standing beside a weathered metal filing cabinet that had been pulled from the abandoned Brennan farmhouse. The cabinet looked like it had survived decades of neglect, its green paint faded and rust staining the corners, but the documents inside were protected by waterproof folders that suggested someone had taken great care to preserve their contents. Jake's face was pale as he held up a manila folder marked with official stamps and warnings. "Dr. Matthews, you need to see this," Jake said, his voice tight with disbelief. "We found these documents in the basement of the Brennan house. They explain everything." Harold took the folder, noting the Department of Defense seal and classification markings that indicated the contents had once been highly restricted. The documents inside detailed a research project called Agricultural Defense Initiative that had been conducted at a facility 20 miles upstream from Cedar Valley between 1987 and 1993. The project's stated purpose was developing biological agents that could protect American livestock from potential biowarfare attacks by creating organisms that would strengthen animal immune systems. But as Harold read through the technical reports, a more disturbing picture emerged. "Jake, this says they were creating hybrid organisms that could adapt to multiple host species and evolve rapidly to counter biological threats," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But look at this." He pointed to a section marked Project Termination. "They shut it down because the organisms became too adaptable. They couldn't control them." Tom Henderson appeared from the house, his face grim. "There's more." The project director was Dr. William Brennan, Old Man Brennan's son. He moved back to the family farm after the project ended and lived here until 2019. Harold felt the pieces clicking together with devastating clarity. Dr. William Brennan had been the project director of a military research program that created uncontrollable biological organisms. When the project was terminated, he'd returned to his family's farm, carrying contaminated materials or research samples that he'd hidden rather than properly disposed of. "The buried containers," Harold said. He was storing biological waste from the project on his family's property. Jake nodded. "And when the containers started leaking 5 years ago, the organisms entered Miller Creek and began spreading to farms downstream. But here's the real problem. According to these documents, the organisms were designed to activate only under specific stress conditions." Harold scanned the technical specifications, his 30 years of veterinary experience helping him translate the military jargon into practical implications. The organisms remained dormant in environmental conditions, but activated when they encountered animal hosts under stress from disease, injury, or nutritional deficiencies. That's why it started with working dogs, Harold realized. Rusty and the other dogs were under constant physical stress from their work. The organisms activated in response to the stress hormones and began their adaptation cycle. Tom's phone rang, and Harold could hear Dr. Kellner's voice even from several feet away. Tom's expression grew increasingly serious as he listened. "They want to evacuate the entire valley," Tom said after ending the call. "Not just the animals, all the people. They're declaring this a biological hazard zone and relocating everyone within a 20-mile radius." Harold looked around the Henderson farm, at buildings that represented 4 generations of careful stewardship, at fields that had fed families and communities for over a century. The federal response would treat Cedar Valley as a contamination site to be cleared and decontaminated, erasing a way of life that had defined the region since the 1880s. "There has to be another solution," Harold said. "If we understand what activates the organisms, maybe we can find a way to control them, instead of just running away." Jake was already back in the documents, searching for information about the organism's vulnerabilities or control mechanisms. "Look at this section about termination protocols," he said. "They tried several approaches to neutralize the organisms when they decided to shut down the project." Harold read over Jake's shoulder, seeing references to environmental pH modification, electromagnetic frequency exposure, and introduction of competitive biological agents. Most of the approaches had failed, but one showed promising results before. The project was terminated for political rather than scientific reasons, Symbiotic bacterial introduction, Harold read aloud. They found that certain naturally occurring soil bacteria could outcompete the engineered organisms for resources and eventually neutralize them completely. Tom leaned closer. What kind of soil bacteria? Jake flipped through several pages of technical specifications. Bacillus subtilis and Pseudomonas fluorescens, both common in agricultural soil. The report says they tested the approach in controlled environments and achieved 93% neutralization of the engineered organisms within 6 weeks. Harold felt a surge of hope for the first time since this crisis began. Bacillus subtilis and Pseudomonas fluorescens were bacterial species he was familiar with. They occurred naturally in healthy farm soil and were already used in some agricultural applications to improve soil health and plant growth. If we could introduce concentrated populations of these bacteria to the affected areas, Harold said, we might be able to neutralize the engineered organisms without evacuating the entire valley. But even as he spoke, Harold could see federal vehicles arriving on the county road. The evacuation order would be implemented within hours, and the opportunity to attempt biological neutralization would disappear as soon as government contractors began decontamination procedures. Jake looked at his father with the expression of a young man who understood that his entire future was about to be decided by forces beyond his control. Dad, what if we don't wait for official approval? What if we try the bacterial treatment on our own property right now? Tom considered the proposal, understanding the risks involved. Unauthorized treatment of a federally controlled biological hazard could result in criminal charges, but allowing the evacuation to proceed would definitely result in the destruction of everything his family had built over 4 generations. Harold, Tom said, if we're going to try this, we need to do it fast and we need to do it right. Can you get the bacterial cultures we'd need? Harold thought about his clinic's laboratory capabilities and his contacts with agricultural extension services. The bacterial species they needed were commercially available for soil improvement applications, and he could prepare concentrated cultures within a few hours. I can get what we need, Harold said, but we'd be taking enormous risks. If this doesn't work, we could face federal prosecution for interfering with a biological hazard response. Jake looked toward the approaching federal vehicles, then back at his father and Harold. And if we don't try, we lose everything anyway. At least this gives us a chance to save the valley and prove that the community approach works better than government evacuation. Harold made his decision, understanding that 30 years of serving the Cedar Valley community had led to this moment. He would use everything he'd learned about veterinary medicine, animal health, and the careful balance of biological systems to attempt something that military researchers had abandoned as too risky to complete. Let's do it, Harold said. But we'll need help from everyone in the community, and we'll need to work faster than we've ever worked before. As federal agents began setting up roadblocks on the county roads, Harold, Tom, and Jake Henderson committed to attempting the most important treatment of Harold's veterinary career, not just saving individual animals, but preserving an entire way of life. Harold's hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared bacterial cultures in his clinic laboratory, but his mind raced with doubts about what they were attempting. The federal evacuation order gave them less than 12 hours before government. Contractors would begin systematic decontamination of the entire valley. 12 hours to accomplish what military researchers had spent months trying to perfect before abandoning the project as too dangerous to complete. Sarah worked beside him, her 15 years of experience with Harold's methods allowing her to anticipate each step in the process. But tonight her usual calm efficiency was strained by the magnitude of what they were attempting and the consequences of failure. "Doc, are you sure about the bacterial concentrations?" she asked, carefully measuring nutrients into culture media. "The military documents specify ratios that seem much higher than anything we've used for soil treatment applications." Harold paused in his preparation of Bacillus subtilis cultures, considering Sarah's concern. The military researchers had been working with engineered organisms far more aggressive than naturally occurring pathogens. Higher bacterial concentrations would be necessary to outcompete the enhanced reproduction rates, but too much could disrupt the entire soil ecosystem. We'll start with moderate concentrations and adjust based on initial results, Harold decided. Better to undertreat and require additional applications than to destroy the natural soil biology that healthy farms depend on. His cell phone rang. Tom Henderson calling from the Community Coordination Center they'd established in the high school gymnasium. Over the past 6 hours, Jake's network of young farmers had mobilized the entire valley into a coordinated response that would have impressed military logistics specialists. "Harold, we've got 43 families committed to the bacterial treatment approach," Tom reported. "Jake's mapped out application routes that will cover every affected property within the quarantine zone. But we've got a problem. Federal agents are setting up checkpoints on all the major roads. Getting treatment supplies to outlying farms is going to be difficult." Harold looked at the bacterial cultures that represented their only hope of saving Cedar Valley without federal evacuation. Even if the treatment worked perfectly, they needed to deliver concentrated bacterial solutions to dozens of farms before government decontamination crews arrived. "What about farm-to-farm routes?" Harold asked. "Most of these families have been neighbors for generations. They know every back road and field access path in the valley." "Jake's working on that now. He's got GPS coordinates for every affected property and alternative routes that avoid federal checkpoints. But Harold, some of these families are scared. They're asking what happens if the federal agents find out what we're doing." Harold understood the fear. Federal prosecution for interfering with a biological hazard response could result in prison sentences and financial penalties that would destroy families already strained by the agricultural crisis. But evacuation would definitely destroy the farming community that had defined Cedar Valley for over a century. "Tom, remind everyone that this is voluntary. Any family that wants to comply with the evacuation order should do so. But for those who want to try saving their farms, we'll give them that option." Dr. Rodriguez appeared at Harold's clinic as he loaded bacterial cultures into transport containers designed for field application. Her expression was troubled, and Harold could see the conflict between her professional obligations and her personal concern for the community she'd come to know over the past week. "Harold, I know what you're planning," she said without preamble. "And I need to tell you officially that I cannot support unauthorized treatment of a federally controlled biological hazard." Harold paused in his work, understanding the position Dr. Rodriguez found herself in. Professional ethics and regulatory compliance required her to oppose his plan, but her scientific training told her the bacterial neutralization approach might actually work. "Elena, I understand your position," Harold said carefully, "but I need to ask you something as one scientist to another. Do you think our approach could work?" Dr. Rodriguez looked around the clinic where she'd spent the past week working alongside Harold to understand the mysterious organisms. "The bacterial species you're using are the same ones that showed promise in the military research. The concentrations appear appropriate for the organism loads you're dealing with. Scientifically, yes, I think it could work. But if it doesn't work completely, if even a small population of the engineered organisms survives and continues evolving, we could be making the situation worse instead of better." Harold absorbed this sobering assessment. The bacterial treatment wasn't guaranteed to work, and partial success could result in more adaptable organisms that would be even harder to control. The choice was between certain destruction through evacuation and uncertain salvation through community action. "Elena, what would you do if this was your community? Your neighbors, your friends, your way of life?" Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, her scientific training warring with her personal understanding of what Cedar Valley meant to the families who'd called it home for generations. I'd probably do exactly what you're doing, she admitted. But Harold, I can't help you officially. If anyone asks, I was never here tonight. After Dr. Rodriguez left, Harold continued preparing bacterial cultures with renewed determination. The scientific risks were real, but the human stakes were even higher. 43 families had chosen to trust his judgment rather than accept federal evacuation, and he was determined to justify that trust. Jake Henderson arrived at the clinic with a pickup truck loaded with agricultural spraying equipment borrowed from farms throughout the valley. The young man's face showed the strain of coordinating a complex operation under impossible time pressure. But his determination remained unshaken. Dr. Matthews, we've got spray equipment for every farm in the valley and volunteers to operate all of it, Jake reported. The bacterial cultures will be applied to every suspected contamination site within 6 hours. Harold helped Jake load transport containers into the truck, marveling at the organizational capability the young farmer had demonstrated over the past day. Jake had coordinated resources, planned logistics, and motivated community participation with the efficiency of someone born to leadership. "Jake, what happens after we complete the applications?" Harold asked. "We wait. Dad says the military documents suggest we should see results within 72 hours if the treatment is working. If the organisms start dying off and the animals begin recovering, we'll know we succeeded. And if not..." Jake's expression grew serious. "Then we evacuate voluntarily and hope the federal response works better than our approach." As they loaded the final containers, Harold reflected on the extraordinary events of the past week. A routine veterinary call had evolved into a crisis that threatened the entire Cedar Valley community, then transformed into a test of whether local knowledge and community cooperation could succeed where government authority had failed. The bacterial cultures in the truck bed represented more than just a potential solution to a biological hazard. They represented the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of veterinary practice, the scientific insights of military researchers who'd understood biological systems better than they'd understood political consequences, and the determination of farming families who'd chosen to fight for their way of life rather than surrender to circumstances beyond their control. Harold climbed into the passenger seat of Jake's truck, his veterinary bag beside him containing everything he'd learned about healing animals and supporting the families who depended on them. Tonight, that knowledge would be tested in ways he'd never imagined when he first opened his practice in Cedar Valley 30 years ago. As they drove toward the first application site, Harold could see federal vehicles patrolling the main roads, their lights creating an atmosphere of military occupation rather than scientific response. But on the farm roads and field access paths, trucks loaded with bacterial cultures moved through the darkness, carrying the hopes of families who'd chosen community action over government protection. The next 12 hours would determine whether Harold's lifetime of service to Cedar Valley would end in triumph or disaster. But for the first time since discovering the mysterious organisms in Rusty's leg, Harold felt confident that they were finally fighting back with the right weapons. Scientific knowledge, community cooperation, and the kind of determination that had built the farming valley in the first place. The application of bacterial cultures began at midnight, with teams of farmers moving across Cedar Valley like a carefully coordinated military operation. Harold rode with Jake Henderson to oversee the treatment at the source, Miller Creek near the abandoned Brennan property where the contamination had originated. The creek moved quietly in the darkness, its surface reflecting stars that seemed impossibly distant from the crisis unfolding along its banks. Harold, "S portable testing kit had been assembled from equipment borrowed from 3 different agricultural extension offices, creating a makeshift laboratory that could provide immediate feedback on bacterial population levels and organism activity. The kit represented 30 years of accumulated contacts and favors, called in during the most critical night of his veterinary career. "Bacterial concentration looks good," Harold reported, testing the first sample from Jake's spray equipment. "We're getting the coverage we need, and the pH levels are optimal for bacterial survival." Jake worked with methodical precision, treating every section of creek bank where soil samples had shown contamination. The young farmer moved with the confidence of someone who understood that his family's four-generation legacy depended on the success of the next few hours. "And Dr. Matthews," Jake called softly, "look at this." Harold followed Jake's flashlight beam to a section of creek bank where the water appeared to be moving differently than the surrounding flow. Small bubbles rose to the surface, and the water had a slightly oily appearance that suggested biological activity. That's organism activity, Harold realized. The contamination is heavier here than our soil samples indicated. Jake increased the bacterial concentration in his spray equipment, applying a double dose to the area around the unusual water flow. Harold watched his portable testing equipment, seeing bacterial population numbers that suggested they were fighting. An organism load much higher than the military documents had described. "Jake, we may need to retreat this area in 6 hours, Harold said. "The bacterial populations are strong, but the organism density is higher than we anticipated." They moved, systematically upstream, treating every section where environmental testing had indicated contamination. Harold's radio crackled with reports from other application teams working throughout the valley. The Patterson farm, reporting successful application. The Kowalski property showing good bacterial coverage. Margaret Schneider's dairy operation, treating the areas where her German Shepherd had first shown symptoms. But as they approached the buried waste containers that were the source of the contamination, Harold's testing equipment began showing readings that made his stomach clench with dread. The organism population around the buried containers was exponentially higher than anywhere else they'd tested, and the bacterial cultures seemed to be struggling to establish viable populations. "Jake, the organisms are too concentrated here," Harold said, watching his test results with growing alarm. "Our bacterial treatment isn't strong enough to handle the organism load at the source." Jake stopped his spraying operation and turned to face Harold. "What does that mean?" "It means even if we successfully treat the downstream contamination, the source will continue producing organisms that will recontaminate the creek and spread to the farms." Harold's radio crackled with Tom Henderson's voice from the Community Coordination Center. "Harold, we've got federal agents asking questions at the roadblocks. They know something's happening, but they haven't figured out what yet. How much more time do you need?" Harold looked at his testing equipment, at the buried containers that continued leaking engineered organisms into Miller Creek, and at Jake, Henderson's face illuminated by flashlight, a young farmer whose entire future depended on the success of their desperate attempt to save Cedar Valley. "Tom, we've got a problem at the source site," Harold reported. "The organism concentration is too high for our bacterial treatment. We need a different approach for the buried containers." Harold thought about the military documents Jake had found, searching his memory for alternative neutralization approaches that might work against the concentrated organism population at the contamination source. Most of the approaches required specialized equipment or chemicals that weren't available in a rural veterinary practice. But there was one approach that might work with resources they could access: environmental pH modification. The military researchers had found that extreme alkaline conditions could neutralize the engineered organisms, though the process would also sterilize the surrounding soil for several years. "Jake, what do you know about lime application for soil?" "pH adjustment. Agricultural lime. We've got tons of it at the farm for pasture management." "Why?" Harold explained the pH neutralization approach, understanding that it would effectively destroy the soil ecosystem around the buried containers, but would eliminate the source of ongoing contamination. Jake considered the proposal, weighing the environmental cost against the necessity of stopping the organism production at its source. If we lime treat the contamination source, will the bacterial applications downstream be enough to handle the existing organisms? Harold checked his testing results from the creek treatment areas, seeing bacterial populations that appeared to be successfully competing with the organisms. Yes, but we'll need to retreat some areas in 72 hours to ensure complete neutralization. As Jake loaded lime-spreading equipment from his truck, Harold felt the weight of the decision they were making. They were about to attempt something that military researchers had considered too environmentally destructive to implement, using agricultural equipment and rural knowledge to solve a problem that had defeated government scientists. The success or failure of the next few hours would determine not just the fate of Cedar Valley's farming community, but whether ordinary people working together could triumph over forces beyond their individual control. The lime application began at 3 a.m., with Jake Henderson's spreader equipment modified to deliver concentrated agricultural lime directly onto the buried waste containers. Harold monitored the process with his testing equipment, watching pH levels rise to the extreme alkaline conditions that military researchers had identified as lethal to the engineered organisms. The process was irreversible. They were sterilizing soil that had supported plant and animal life for thousands of years. pH is reaching target levels, Harold reported, watching his portable instruments register environmental conditions that would destroy every living organism in the treated area. But Jake, we're essentially creating a dead zone around the contamination source. Jake continued the lime application with methodical determination, understanding that environmental damage was preferable to evacuation of the entire valley. How? Long before we know if it's working. Harold consulted the military documents, finding references to organism die-off rates under extreme alkaline conditions. The documents suggest we should see significant organism population reduction within 6 hours, complete neutralization within 24 hours. As the lime treatment continued, Harold's radio brought reports from bacterial application teams throughout Cedar Valley. The downstream treatments appeared to be working. Bacterial populations were establishing successfully, and preliminary testing suggested the engineered organisms were beginning to decline in areas where contamination levels were manageable. Margaret Schneider reported that her German Shepherd was showing the first signs of improvement since the crisis began. The Patterson family's cattle dog was alert and responsive for the first time in days. Small victories that suggested the bacterial treatment approach was sound, even if the source contamination required more drastic measures. But at 4:30 a.m., Harold's testing equipment began showing readings that made his heart race with alarm. The lime treatment was neutralizing organisms at the buried container site, but it was also creating chemical runoff that was moving downstream toward the areas where bacterial treatments were establishing. Jake, stop the lime application, Harold called urgently. We're creating alkaline runoff that's going to kill our bacterial populations downstream. Jake shut down the spreader equipment and joined Harold at the testing station. The portable instruments showed pH levels in Miller Creek rising rapidly as lime-contaminated water flowed toward the Henderson farm and other downstream properties. If the alkaline runoff kills our bacterial populations before they can neutralize, the existing organisms, Harold said, will have made the situation worse instead of better. Jake stared at the creek that had watered his family's farm for 4 generations, now carrying chemical contamination that threatened to destroy their last hope of saving Cedar Valley without federal evacuation. What can we do? Harold thought frantically about pH buffering approaches, chemical neutralization techniques, and environmental management strategies he'd learned over 30 years of veterinary practice. Most approaches required specialized equipment or chemicals that weren't available at 4 a.m. on a rural farm. Organic matter, Harold said suddenly. Massive amounts of organic matter to buffer the alkaline runoff and provide nutrients for bacterial survival. Jake looked around the Henderson farm, calculating available resources that could be mobilized immediately. Manure from the cattle, operation, compost from the sheep paddocks, hay that's been contaminated and can't be used for feed. Within 30 minutes, they had organized a convoy of manure spreaders, hay wagons and compost equipment from farms throughout the valley. Organic matter was applied directly to Miller Creek at strategic points downstream from the lime treatment site, creating biological buffers that would absorb alkaline runoff and provide nutrients to support bacterial populations. Harold quote S testing. Equipment showed pH levels beginning to stabilize as organic matter absorbed the chemical runoff. More importantly, bacterial populations that had been declining began to recover and establish viable colonies in the buffered areas. "It's working," Harold reported to the radio network. "Bacterial populations are stabilizing, pH levels are returning to normal ranges, and organism populations are continuing to decline." As dawn approached, Harold and Jake completed final applications and began the systematic testing that would determine the success or failure of their desperate attempt to save Cedar Valley. Harold's portable instruments showed bacterial populations establishing dominance over engineered organisms throughout the creek system, while pH levels returned to ranges that could support normal soil and water ecosystems. The lime-treated area around the buried containers would remain sterile for years, a permanent scar on the landscape that marked the source of the crisis. But downstream, bacterial colonies were thriving in competition with engineered organisms, beginning the biological warfare that military researchers had abandoned as too unpredictable to control. Harold quote S radio crackled with Tom Henderson's voice. From the Community Coordination Center. "Harold, federal agents are demanding access to the valley. They say the evacuation order takes effect at 8 a.m. regardless of what we've accomplished." Harold looked at his testing equipment, showing results that suggested their community response was succeeding where government intervention had failed. But success would be meaningless if federal agents arrested everyone involved in the unauthorized treatment before they could demonstrate that Cedar Valley was safe. "Tom, we need 6 more hours to prove the treatment is working," Harold replied. "Can the community hold the federal response back that long?" "We're about to find out," Tom answered, "because here they come." 6 months later, Harold stood in his clinic examining Rusty, whose leg showed no trace of the swelling that had started the crisis. The border collie's recovery had been complete, and he was back to working sheep on the Henderson farm with the same energy and intelligence that had made him Tom's most trusted partner. The dog's healthy appearance represented more than successful treatment. It represented the triumph of community knowledge over institutional authority. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had returned to Cedar Valley for a follow-up study, officially documenting the success of the bacterial neutralization approach that had saved the farming community from evacuation. Her research would be published in agricultural journals and veterinary publications, providing a model for community-based responses to biological emergencies. "Harold, the bacterial populations are completely stable," Dr. Rodriguez reported, reviewing environmental samples from Miller Creek and surrounding farms. "The engineered organisms have been neutralized throughout the valley, and normal soil ecosystems are recovering faster than we predicted." Harold nodded, understanding that scientific validation was important but secondary to the practical reality that Cedar Valley's farms were healthy and productive again. The crisis had strengthened rather than destroyed the community bonds that had sustained the valley for over a century. Tom Henderson entered the clinic carrying a leather-bound ledger that had replaced the worn farm record books that had documented 4 generations of agricultural operations. The new ledger reflected the modernized farming approaches Jake had implemented, combining traditional stewardship with innovative techniques that had made the Henderson farm a model for sustainable agriculture. "Harold, Jake wanted you to see the latest numbers," Tom said. opening the ledger to pages filled with production data, soil health measurements, and financial projections. The organic matter we applied during the crisis has improved soil fertility beyond anything we've seen in decades. Harold smiled, understanding that environmental necessity had led to agricultural innovation that benefited the entire valley. The organic matter applications required to buffer alkaline runoff had enriched soil throughout the creek system, creating growing conditions that supported higher crop yields and healthier livestock. "What about the federal response?" Harold asked. Tom. Quote's expression grew serious. "They're still not happy about the unauthorized treatment, but they can't argue with results. The valley is clean, the animals are healthy, and the community is stronger than before the crisis." The federal investigation had concluded that Cedar Valley's response, while technically illegal, had achieved better outcomes than official evacuation and decontamination procedures would have provided. Harold and the other community leaders had received official reprimands rather than criminal charges, and the incident had sparked policy discussions about incorporating local knowledge into federal emergency responses. Jake Henderson appeared in the clinic doorway, his face showing the confidence of a young farmer who had successfully navigated his first major crisis. The experience had transformed him from an ambitious college graduate into a proven leader who commanded respect from farmers twice his age. "Dr. Matthews, I wanted to tell you about the cooperative we're forming," Jake said. 15 farms are pooling resources for soil testing, bacterial culture production, and environmental monitoring. We're calling it the Cedar Valley Agricultural Defense Cooperative. Harold understood the significance of the cooperative's formation. The crisis had demonstrated that community action could succeed where individual efforts failed, and the farmers were institutionalizing the collaboration that had saved their way of life. "Who's providing the technical expertise?" Harold asked. "You are, if you're willing," Jake replied. "We want you to serve as the cooperative's veterinary advisor, helping us monitor animal health and environmental conditions throughout the valley." Harold considered the proposal, understanding that it would formalize his role as more than just a veterinarian. He would become a guardian of the agricultural ecosystem that sustained Cedar Valley's farming community. Sarah emerged from the back office, carrying files that contained health records for every animal in the valley. Her meticulous documentation during the crisis had provided crucial data for understanding the organism's spread pattern and the effectiveness of bacterial treatment. Dr. Kellner called from the state lab," Sarah reported. "They want to establish a permanent monitoring station here in Cedar Valley, with you as the local coordinator." Harold absorbed this information, understanding that the crisis had elevated Cedar Valley from an obscure farming community to a model for biological emergency response. The knowledge they'd gained through necessity would benefit agricultural communities throughout the region. Margaret Schneider's German Shepherd trotted into the clinic with the vigor of a dog half his age, his recovery from the mysterious organism infection complete and permanent. Margaret followed, carrying fresh eggs from her dairy operation that had not only survived the crisis, but expanded to meet increased demand from consumers impressed by the community's environmental stewardship. "Harold, I wanted to thank you again," Margaret said. "Not just for saving Rex, but for saving all of us." Harold looked around his clinic, filled with healthy animals and the people who cared for them. The worn veterinary bag that had belonged to his mentor sat on the counter, its leather surface bearing new stains and wear marks from the most challenging case of Harold's career. The bag had carried the tools and knowledge necessary to save Cedar Valley, but the community's survival had depended on more than veterinary medicine. It had required trust, cooperation, and the kind of determination that builds lasting communities. 6 months after discovering mysterious organisms in Rusty's swollen leg, Harold understood that the crisis had changed Cedar Valley in fundamental ways. The farming community was stronger, more innovative, and better prepared for future challenges. Most importantly, they had proven that ordinary people working together could triumph over forces that seemed beyond their control. As evening settled over the valley, Harold walked outside his clinic and looked across fields where healthy livestock grazed on soil enriched by their desperate attempt to save their way of life. The crisis was over, but the lessons it had taught about community, cooperation, and the power of local knowledge would sustain Cedar Valley for generations to come.